Hello everyone, History with Hilbert here, and today I'm going to be talking about the Boer War. Now when I said the words Boer War, did you think about this? Or maybe this? Or perhaps even this? Well, congratulations my friends, you're thinking of the Second Boer War, but if we look at what it's called, the Second Boer War, then that implies that there was one before it, the First Boer War. The Second Boer War was fought between 1899 and 1902 between the British and the various Boer republics. However, there was another war, the First Boer War, which was fought from 1818 to 1881. The First Boer War pit the British Empire against the independent Boer Republic called Transvaal by the British and the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek by the Afrikaners, as well as being supported by the Oranje Vrystaat, the other Boer Republic in South Africa. But before we go any further, we need to have a look at some context. The Cape of Good Hope had been a Dutch refreshing station for VOC ships since the early 17th century, but in 1814, with Napoleon on the rise in Europe, the British annexed the colony for themselves. However, the Dutch inhabitants of the Cape Colony were not huge fans of the British and decided to leave in what they called the Groot Trek, or the Great Trek in English. If you're interested, I've got a video about that you can watch. Leaving the British alone in South Africa with the native population and those whites who did decide to stay there. Meanwhile, the Afrikaners, the Boers, went into South Africa, into the hinterland, and they explored the place, opening it up for colonization, where they eventually founded the two Boer republics of the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. A quick note about their names is that the Afrikaans names and the British names do differ slightly. Now, in English, obviously, you have the Orange Free State, and in Afrikaans, or technically in Dutch, because it's hard to tell when Afrikaans begins and Dutch ends, so the official language in the Oranje Vrystaat was actually Dutch, even though they were speaking Afrikaans, so it's a little complicated. But essentially the Afrikaans name is the Oranje Vrystaat, which means exactly the same as the Orange Free State. However, the other republic, the British were calling it the Transvaal. The Vaal was one of the rivers, and Transvaal was the area on the other side of the Vaal. However, the Afrikaners, the Boers, were calling it the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, shortened to ZAR, which meant the South African Republic. One trigger causing tension between the Boers and the British government in South Africa was certainly the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1868 and the subsequent diamond rush that brought lots of foreigners to the areas where the Boers were living. Now, the location of Kimberley is very important because Kimberley is actually on the border of the Transvaal, the Oranje Vrystaat, and the British Cape Colony in South Africa. So all three of these independent entities were claiming it was part of their territory. So this was certainly a cause of unrest between them. Now at this time, of course, the British were playing the imperial game. Britain didn't have that many territories in Africa at the time. They had the Cape Colony in the very south of Africa, and then in the interior of southern Africa you obviously had the two Boer republics. But just to the west you had German Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. You had the Portuguese in what's now Angola and Mozambique. The French were on Madagascar, and you even had the Belgians further north in the Belgian Congo. And the British were quite worried that one of these nations, if they didn't take over control of the Boer republics, would come down and take over. And obviously the British didn't want this. They wanted to get as much of Africa for their own and to stop the growth of other European powers, other European colonial powers in the region. The British do actually advance several times in South Africa. They move across. In my previous video about the Great Trek, I mentioned how they annexed the Boer Republic of Natalia before the other two were formed. And the British, of course, also move up into the area of Kimberley after the Diamond Rush. A very direct cause of the First Boer War was the expansion of the Zulu kingdom under King Cetshwayo. Now, the Zulus were a very warlike tribe from the region that's now on the coast of South Africa, and just before the First Boer War, you had the Zulu War. And before the Zulu War, the Zulus were causing quite a lot of trouble in the area where they were living, and the Boers were very scared, very nervous about the Zulu situation because they thought that the Zulus were about to invade their lands and to stoke up unrest between the native peoples who lived in the Boer republics. Now, the British decided to act first, and in 1877 they annexed the Transvaal with the pretext of keeping it safe from the Zulus. Now, of course, the Boers weren't particularly happy with this, but at the end of the day, they'd rather have the British there than the Zulus. Soon after the annexation, the British declared war on the Zulus, and the Zulu War began. During the Zulu War, the Boers didn't really fight alongside the British, as they did feel they were being occupied, but they did help the British tactically and suggested fighting the Zulus defensively by building wagon forts which they called lagers. But all the British could hear was on the 22nd of January 1879, Isandlwana happened. Although the British column was massacred at Isandlwana, they managed to bounce back with reinforcements from the surface, and in the end they won the Zulu War. On the 20th of December, a British column en route from Pretoria was stopped by a Boer envoy who told Lieutenant Colonel Anstruster to turn him and his column back, stating that the Transvaal had declared independence and that marching any further would be a violation of its sovereign territorial rights. Anstruster refused and started to hand out ammunition. Moments later, at 12:30, the Boers opened fire, and within 15 minutes, 156 of the British lay dead, and 122 who remained were captured. The Boers only lost 2 men during the whole attack. The first engagement of the Boer War would be called the Battle of Bronkhorstspruit, after the little river that lay not far away. However, the Boers had already declared independence 4 days earlier, on the 16th of December. A rather funny story states that the war was caused because of a wagon. The British authorities wanted to commandeer Piet Bezuidenhout, a Boer's wagon, for their own use. However, Piet was not very happy, and he soon came back with 100 of his Boer friends and retook the wagon. The first shots were fired when the British tried to stop this from happening, although ultimately they failed. The British soon learned not to come between a Boer and his wagon. Boer republics had no real professional army like the British army that came to fight them. Instead, every man from the farm would come and join what was called a commando, which is essentially a posse. Now, the men would be very good at shooting, and often the Boer marksmen were far superior to any in the British army, as the Boers relied on their weapons to get any meat for the dinner table, so they knew that if they missed once, then the animal was gone, so they were trained to shoot once and hit every time, which really shows in the battles such as Bronkhorstspruit, where they inflicted huge casualties. Now, as well, the Boers were mainly dressed in khaki in everyday clothes, which blended in with the African veld, as it's called, the field. Now, as well, the Boers had been trained to use every bit of cover which they would use when hunting animals, so they were often very hard to detect for British forces, and they could blend in with surroundings and use bits of cover that the British line infantry could not. The British, on the other hand, had not been trained at all with how to deal with guerrillas, and this infinitely they didn't. The British, on the other hand, had not been taught at all how to deal with guerrilla infantry. Some lessons really should have been learned after the American Revolution. As well, the British were still dressed in bright uniforms, the Highlanders still wore their kilts, and pretty much every regiment was still dressed in bright red, which obviously stands out like a sore thumb against the South African landscape. The British also relied heavily on cavalry, which also wasn't a good idea when the people they were trying to chase were also on horses, had been in horses since they were born, had lived pretty much all their life in the saddle, and were shooting back at them. From late December 1880, all the major British garrisons in Transvaal, Wakkerstroom, Standerton, Marabastad, Potchefstroom, Rustenburg and Leidenburg, all came under siege from Boer forces. The British saw this as the Transvaal Rebellion. Sir George Colley, a British general, assembled troops and a relief force in Newcastle in the Natal province, with the aim of going and relieving the beleaguered garrisons in the Transvaal. However, the British found their path barred by a Boer commando at a place called Laing's Neck. The Laing's Neck was a pass through the Drakensberg mountains, which the British force needed to get through to get to the interior of Transvaal. However, the Boers had occupied the heights around Laing's Neck, making it impossible for the British to come through. Now, the first thing that the British did to try and force the Boers off the heights was to open an artillery barrage. After the artillery barrage failed to send the Boers fleeing, they sent in the cavalry. The cavalry tried to charge, but they were driven back by accurate Boer fire from an opposite hillside. And again, the Boer marksmanship really does help. Meanwhile, the British were trying to advance towards the Boer positions on the heights, but once the British reached the top, they were fired on by Boer marksmen from an unseen trench, and they were forced to retreat. Now, the Battle of Laing's Neck is the last time that regimental colours were brought into battle by a British regiment, because in the Battle of Laing's Neck, 4 different officers were shot down by Boer marksmen trying to retrieve the colours, and finally the British got the memo that maybe it wasn't such a good idea to have so many men recklessly and foolishly throwing their lives away to try and save the bit of cloth with the colours drawn on it. A short time after Laing's Neck, the British and the Boer commandos met again at the Battle of Schuinshoogte, and again the Boers were victorious and the British suffered many casualties. Now, this led up to the final battle of the Boer War, the First Boer War, which was the deciding battle. And it pit again Sir George Colley's force, which was this time around 400 British infantry of the 58th, 92nd and some Marines of the HMS Dido, against Generaal Nicolaas Smith's commando of around 400 Boer irregulars. Now, the final battle was called the Battle of Majuba Hill, which means the Hill of the Doves in Zulu. Now, a few things to cover before I go into the events of the battle is some of the basic geography of Majuba Hill. There are some points of interest, such as this, which is Gordon's Knoll, which is essentially a little bit that sticks out on top, as well as MacDonald's Kop, which is similar to Gordon's Knoll and higher up on the mountain, easily defendable locations. Now, the British, after being defeated at Schuinshoogte and at Laing's Neck, they went to the top of Majuba Hill, again commanded by Sir George Colley, with the 92nd Gordon Highlanders securing the area between MacDonald's Kop and Gordon's Knoll, and the other regiments standing on the other side of the hill. Now, the Boers were encamped not very far away on the other side of Majuba. The Boers initially thought that the British were going to start shelling them with artillery, but when this didn't happen, they started to climb up the far side of Majuba Hill, unaware of the presence of the 92nd Gordon Highlanders. When they did find out that there was a regiment up there, a shootout started between the Boers and the Highlanders. Now, this shootout continued for a long while, although Sir George Colley didn't commit any more troops to it, and the Gordon Highlanders were at a severe disadvantage when they were fighting against the Boer marksmen who were trained to shoot and kill from long range. Now, the Boers, they made very good use of fire in advance, and at 12:45, Commando Ferreira's commando managed to capture Gordon's Knoll, which was only defended by a handful of Highlanders, forcing the other Highlanders back. The Boers were some of the first people to employ the fire in advance technique, where one group of the commando would keep the enemy pinned down while another group crossed the open ground. Because, of course, while Majuba Hill wasn't a hill, there was not much cover in certain areas, especially the bit before Gordon's Knoll. So to counteract this and to stop the Highlanders from simply shooting all the Boers as they came across the open ground, one section of the commando would pin them down with accurate fire, while another section would storm across the open ground until they got to cover, until they had enough men on the other side to capture Gordon's Knoll, which they did. Now, after this, the capture of Gordon's Knoll, the Boers, again, they have a second wave of attack, where they come around and attack the 58th Regiment. Meanwhile, other Boer forces move in and capture MacDonald's Cup, as well as sending in smaller parties to scale the much steeper side, who then engaged with the Marines of the HMS Dido. Now at this point the British are becoming surrounded, and the Boers essentially they come up on the heights and start firing down onto the British who are on the plateau of Majuba Hill, at which point they really start to panic. And it's George Colley was a very ineffective leader at this point, and the British were surrounded on every side by Boer marksmen who literally at some points they just stood and shot at the British point blank while they had no idea what was going on. Final stages of Majuba Hill is essentially the completion of the encirclement of the British by the Boers and the pell-mell retreat down Majuba Hill, down the other side of the British after they were defeated. Now Sir George Colley also met his end here. Several Boers claim to have killed Colley. Toe dit nou klaar was, loop ek die 10 tot 12 tree na die gouverneur, waarbij dan nou al reeds 2 burgers en een hotnot staan. Toe ek by die gouverneur kom, neem ek sy helm by die pen en lig dit van sy gezicht. Colley was dood. Die kool had door hem die helm en bo die rechteroog ingegaan en achter die linkeroor uitgekom. Ons was die dag onder bevel van generaal Joachim Ferreira, J.A. van Tonder, Boerkommando. When the Boers came to tend the British wounded, the British were amazed and not just a little bit humiliated by the fact that the Boers were pretty much all young lads, some just around 14 or 15 years old, with a lot of pensioners fighting alongside them. It's quite an interesting thing there that at Majuba Hill, the people who had inflicted this terrible defeat, this humiliating defeat on the British, a lot of them were just young lads and quite a few old grey faces. Already before Majuba there were peace talks underway, and it's actually thanks to the other Boer Republic, the Orange Free State, the President Brandt, that he was the intermediate between the British and the Boers. And it was in 1881 that the Boers of the Transvaal, or the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, after the humiliating defeat of the British at Majuba Hill, signed the Pretoria Convention with the British Empire, which then basically said that the South African Republic had a right to exist and gave them their independence back as long as they and the Orange Free State recognised the Queen as the sovereign, but they were still essentially independent. So yeah, that's the first Boer War, or what I made of it at least. Please let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more. I'm going to make a few more videos about the Boers and South African history. Obviously there's the second Boer War, which there's a lot to talk about, as well as some extra little interesting ones that you might not have heard of. So I'm probably going to be returning to this topic at some point in the future. Let me know as well. I know some people have been asking if I could do this in Afrikaans. I can't actually speak Afrikaans. I mean I did a little bit there, but that was me just reading. It would be an interesting challenge though, to see if I could. But yeah, for now this has been me, History with Hilbert. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like, thumbs up. Want to know anything else about it, then just leave a comment in the comment section below. And don't forget to tune in again next time for more History with Hilbert.